call me father.
Hey everyone, it's Sevy. The House of the Hearth welcomes you to bask in the fatherness of our father. And to help you with that, this guide will go over Arlecchino's kit, talents, constellations, best artifact and weapon builds, team synergies, gameplay tips, and more. Let's begin. Arlecchino is a 5-star Pyro polearm DPS with a normal attack-focused playstyle buffed by her Bond of Life mechanic. Let's review her kit to see how her talents and passives turn her into a formidable damage dealer. A very important aspect of Arlecchino is in her passive talent, which replaces the usual exploration-related passive. During combat, she gains a 40% Pyro damage bonus, but more importantly, she can only be healed via her burst, Bale Moon Rising. This unique property has significant implications for her gameplay and teams, which we'll learn more about as we go along. Moving on to her abilities, using her skill makes her dash towards enemies to cleave them with pyro damage and apply the Blood Debt Directive mark for 30 seconds. Every 5 seconds, this mark will deal 1 instance of very low pyro damage, which can trigger twice. The dash also has a considerable range, which is helpful for closing the gap versus enemies. If you use her charged attack, then that will absorb any marks present, each granting her the Bond of Life worth 65% of her max HP. However, you may not want or need to absorb it right away because of her Ascension 1 passive. If a directive mark lasts for 5 seconds, it upgrades to a Blood Debt Due mark, which now grants her a Bond of Life worth 130% max HP or double the original value. If you're fighting single target bosses, then this is also better so you can maximize the Bond of Life amount acquired. Though if there are multiple enemies, you can also just mark and absorb them ASAP. That will still give her a lot of Bond of Life due to absorbing multiple sources. But if an enemy with a mark is defeated by any teammate, she still gains the upgraded 130% Bond of Life value. This can be sort of a fail-safe if the opponent dies earlier before the directive mark can be upgraded after 5 seconds, or just a more aggressive method of getting her maximum Bond of Life if you can kill the enemy really fast anyway. In any case, the Bond of Life she can gain this way is up to 145% max HP. And the reason you want to activate Bond of Life and have a high amount is to enhance her attacks. When Arlecchino has Bond of Life greater than or equal to 30% of her max HP, she will be in the Mask of the Red Death state, during which her melee attacks are infused with Pyro, which can't be overridden. Even if she switches out, as long as she has enough Bond of Life, she'll still retain her Red Death state, so her rotations can be more flexible. Essentially, the higher her Bond of Life is, the more damage her normal attacks will do. Every normal attack she does reduces her skill cooldown by 0.8 seconds, but it also consumes 7.5% of the current Bond of Life. So as you use her attacks, the Bond of Life gradually decreases, thereby also reducing her damage over time. Note as well that this buff only affects her normal attacks, not her charged or plunging attacks, making her combos largely normal attack focused, which are fairly easy to execute, especially when compared to someone like Hu Tao, who needs normal plus charge attack combos with animation cancels to maximize her damage. Mechanically speaking, you could say she's similar to Yoimiya, but in melee form. While her charged attack is mainly used for absorbing marks, it also has a special property where if you hold it, this busts out her half wing to make her levitate and boost her movement speed, and even lets her move above water. Moving on, Arlecchino's burst does a couple of things. First of all, it plays one of the sickest burst animations ever, during which it absorbs marks that are still present on field, which will give her Bond of Life. Then after the animation ends, it deals AoE pyro damage and heals her based on 150% of her current Bond of Life amount plus 150% of her attack stat. Basically, a big chunk of this healing will get absorbed first by the Bond of Life, then whatever excess there is will go into healing her actual HP. This is the only way to heal herself, and that will also be your primary purpose for casting it. As long as she's sufficiently built, it will be able to heal her to high or full health even from a low HP state. The burst cast also fully resets her skill cooldown, which can affect your rotations. If you need to heal a lot, it's best to mark enemies first to absorb a high Bond of Life amount. Afterwards, it will completely get rid of her Bond of Life, thereby removing her Pyro infusion and relevant damage bonuses until you regain her Bond of Life. Thankfully, using her burst isn't super necessary for her damage, so it's technically something you can also just choose to activate when you need the healing. However, having it reliably ready also feels safer, especially in high damage combat scenarios, so there's also good reason to want to address her energy needs if you want to security. To help make her tankier, Arlecchino's Ascension 4 passive gives 1% all elemental and physical resistance for every 100 attacks she has in excess of 1000. The maximum resistance increase she can gain this way is 20%, which caps at 3000 attack. This will be really helpful for survival, especially due to her healing restrictions. Note that attack percent buffs from external sources like a teammate's noblesse set or Chevre's skill do affect this. However, Bennett and Sarah's attack buffs, or the Wandering Even Star's team attack buff, do not affect it. You don't have to force yourself to hit 3000 attack just to maximize this though. Regular, fully invested builds plus relevant buffs already give a fairly good amount of attack. Weapons with attack percent stats and high base attack will help a lot as well. At the very least, you're not losing damage even if you don't max it out, since this is a purely defensive passive. To wrap up her kit, let's go over what her rotation and gameplay will generally be like. First, you open with her skill to mark enemies with directives. Then you can switch to her teammates to set up their buffs and abilities. Once you're done setting them up, the directives should have transformed into dews. So you can now switch to Arlecchino, use her charge attack to absorb the dews and get her Bond of Life, then use her normal attacks to dish out all that damage. After around 10 to 12 seconds of attacking, her teammates' buffs and abilities will need refreshing and her skill cooldown would have reset, and you can restart your rotation by marking the enemies again. Depending on her HP and energy, you can also begin or end rotations by healing with her burst, possibly marking the enemies first if you want to absorb more Bond of Life to heal with. However, once she starts her normal attack combos, I would generally hold off on using her burst too soon, since using it essentially ends her Red Death state, which you'll need to restart with her skill again, unless you're intentionally going for specific rotations or certain teams, or need it for emergency healing. I generally find her gameplay loop and basic rotation to be quite manageable to pick up. The main thing you will likely want to watch out for is her health and survivability, given the limitation on healing her. At C0, she also has no innate resistance to interruption increase during her buff state, and it definitely feels bad getting staggered mid-combo. So dodging will go a long way, or you can lean on defensive supports, which we'll discuss later on in the teams section. So when leveling her talents, prioritize her normal attack talent, as this is her main damage source and it boosts her buffed state. Then you can level up her skill and burst to increase the damage you'll gain from them too. When farming for Arlecchino, you'll need materials from the new Golem Boss, Rainbow Roses, and Fatui Insignias. Then her talents will need the Order series, more Fatui Insignias, and Fading Candle boss materials from herself. Arlecchino is already impressively strong at C0, but for those interested in her constellations, let's see what they do. C1 first increases her Red Death state's buff by 100%. Second, it gives her increased interruption resistance when she's doing normal attacks in the state, which makes her gameplay feel smoother, especially if you can't dodge as well and prefer to play her without a shielder. This is a potent early constellation that will make her both stronger and easier to play. By itself, it's already a good early stopping point. C2 makes it so that Blood Debt Directive marks are automatically now the upgraded Blood Debt Dews version, meaning you no longer have to wait for the 5-second duration. Additionally, when she absorbs a dew, she unleashes a big AoE pyro damage and gets extra resistance bonuses, which can be triggered once every 10 seconds. This constellation gives her more rotation flexibility, makes her tankier, and lets her front load even more damage, making it another good stopping point. C3 increases her normal attack level by 3, which is a significant bump in damage since it's her main damage source. It's the hard stopping point for those who really want to invest a lot more into her but don't want to commit to getting C6. C4 lets you decrease her burst's cooldown and gain some energy when she absorbs a debt directive, and this can occur once every 10 seconds. It enables you to use it sooner if needed and reduces her energy targets, but it's not really that significant of an impact in terms of damage or gameplay. C5 increases her burst level by 3, and finally, C6 is a massive power spike as usual. Arlecchino's burst gets a huge base damage increase based on her attack and Bond of Life, and after using her skill, her normal attacks and burst will gain 10% crit rate and 70% crit damage for 20 seconds. So in summary, C1 to C3 have good benefits, but again, aren't necessary to make her already strong, and the quality of life upgrades of her C1 and C2 have workarounds at C0. Now that we're familiar with how she works, let's discuss how to build her, starting with her artifacts. By default, her main stats will be an attack sans, pyro damage goblet, and a crit rate or damage circlet, whichever gives you a good crit ratio. As alternatives, an EM sans can be competitive in a vaporize or melt playstyle. It would ideally fall within 200 to 300 EM, as too much EM will also suffer greatly from diminishing returns. An attack sans may also be more preferable if she's already getting a lot of EM sources from teammates, substats, or external buffs. Meanwhile, an attack goblet can potentially be not that far behind a damage goblet, depending on how much damage and attack bonuses she's already getting from other buff sources. These alternatives can expand your artifact piece options and help balance stat distribution. You can determine what that's more optimal or how big the difference is for your own case by using the Genshin Optimizer app or practically testing your team setup. For substats, go for crit, attack, and EM in Vapor Melt teams. Her energy recharge target can either be none at all or generally around 120 to 130%. It depends if you don't really find yourself needing to burst every rotation or would rather be able to do so. As always, your team, combat scenario, and energy generating equipment can affect your ER target, so it's best to test your own case as well. Let's move on to artifact sets. The new artifact set, Fragment of Harmonic Whimsy, is her general best in slot by a noticeable margin. It gives attack and a stackable damage bonus when the user's bond of life changes, which for Arlecchino will easily max out and be maintained for a big 54% damage bonus. You can definitely farm this if you're very dedicated to maxing her out, but since it's a new domain, it'll take a while before you get actually good pieces for a full set. Also, the new burning related set it's paired with is extremely niche to farm for. At least the domain gives 2-piece attack sets, which are fairly widely used. However, there are other sets that can still perform quite well for her, whether as your temporary or permanent build, so let's go over those next. For a very flexible build, you can always just go for 2-piece combos of attack sets, Crimson Witch for pyro damage, Marechaussee for the normal and charge attack damage, and EM sets for Vaporizer Melt playstyles. This gives you a lot more room to choose pieces with the right main stats and better substats to make it competitive with other full sets. Then there's the Gladiator's Finale set, which you passively farm by doing boss fights and from occasional random rewards. It gives attack and a 35% normal attack damage bonus. It only affects her normals, unlike a universal or pyro damage bonus, but that's her biggest damage source anyway, so it's fine. If you're a longtime player, it's very likely you've gotten really good Gladiator pieces too. Another is the Gilded Dreams, which gives a nice amount of EM and attack bonuses, and this will be good for her Vaporizer Melt teams. If you already have a good set, then go ahead, but it's not something I'd recommend farming specifically for her. The Crimson Witch set is technically an option too, but due to rotations where you switch Arlecchino out for about 5 seconds or more after using her skill, the pyro damage bonus buff from its 4-piece effect uptime is already very reduced on her, which makes it practically very close to a 2-piece pyro and 2-piece EM set that you might as well just aim for that combo and get better substats. But if you already have a good Crimson set anyway, then it's definitely still usable. There's also the 4-piece Marechaussee if you're playing her with Farina, but there are certain reservations about comping them together that we'll discuss later in the teams section. Lastly, the Lava Walker set gives a damage bonus buff on pyro affected enemies, so it's restricted to only a mono pyro team. Next, let's take a look at her possible weapons from free to premium options. For purely free weapons, the White Tassel has a low base attack due to being a 3-star, but that can be compensated quite well by using Bennett. It's got a nice crit rate substat and big normal attack damage bonus at R5, so in Bennett teams, it's a really good option even as a 3-star. However, you can only get copies from Liyue chests. A potentially close alternative is the Missive Wind Spear, an event reward from version 3.1. It gives a lot of attack and some EM, so it's best in her Vape or Melt teams. But if you've played that long, it's likely you already acquired better options anyway. One more is the Black Cliff Pole, which is from the Star Glitter shop. It's a nice crit stat stick, but the main issue of its passive is that the user needs to defeat an enemy to trigger the bonus. This diminishes its potential versus purely single target bosses. I also don't personally recommend using Star Glitter to purchase this, but if you already have it, then it's fine. Among 4-star paid and gacha options, first up are the Battle Pass weapons Deathmatch and Ballad of the Fjords. Deathmatch is generally more universal thanks to its big crit rate bonus plus an attack bonus, and its defense bonus is actually helpful for Arlecchino's survivability when she can't heal from other teammates. On the other hand, Ballad also gives crit rate, but the passive gives EM, so this is best used in Vape or Melt teams, assuming you hit its 3 different element requirement, and more so if she's not getting that much EM from elsewhere. These are strictly paid options, so it's only for BP buyers, and at max refinements, they are fairly competitive versus most R1 5-star weapons. However, if you do have 5-star options, then those can just be preferable already. Next, the Lithic Spear is fairly good, particularly at high refinements, assuming you're using a Liyue heavy team of course. Being a limited banner 4-star and having that condition makes this more inaccessible and less versatile though. Last is the Dragon's Bane, which is particularly for a vaporized playstyle since it gives EM and a damage bonus on hydro affected enemies. Moving on to 5 stars, among them she has her signature weapon Crimson Moon Semblance, which unlocks massive style points by turning into a scythe when wielded by Arlecchino. It comes with a high base attack, a crit rate substat, a passive that gives Bond of Life by doing a charged attack, and a universal damage bonus based on the Bond of Life they have. It's tailor-made to a Bond of Life playstyle, so Arlecchino fully maximizes its potential. For those considering spending more on her between pulling this and her C1, the benefits you get from pulling her weapon will depend on the pole arms you already have. passive. For example, if you already have one of the more recommended 5-star pole arms or high refinements of the BP or Gacha 4 stars, then getting her R1 will offer less of a damage increase compared to her C1. On the other hand, if you're starting from a free-to-play weapon, then her C1 and R1 will both be impactful DPS increases on paper, but since C1 also eases her gameplay with interruption resistance and you might prefer to go shieldless, I would recommend that over her R1. But her signature also completes her style to an unholy degree, so there's that incentive, which is understandable. Other 5-star pole arms will generally be good stat sticks, and the most recommended alternatives are the Jade Spear, Staff of Homa, and Staff of Scarlet Sands for reaction teams, all performing fairly close with each other. If you have them, the Calamity Queller and Vortex Vanquisher are mainly big attack stat sticks that are slightly better than her free options. These are also more maximized in teams without Bennett's huge attack buff. Skyward Spine also generally performs slightly better than her free-to-play options and can cover her ER needs to burst every rotation, so it's a fairly solid option if you have it. Finally, let's discuss her team synergies and templates. As a Pyro DPS, Arlecchino follows the usual Pyro-focused templates, performing well in most of them. If you're familiar with the teams of Hu Tao, Yoimiya, or Yanfei, then they share a lot of similarities with Arlecchino's comps as well, with a core difference being her inability to be healed by teammates. A primary option for her defensive supports will be shielders like Zhongli, Layla, Toma, and so on, who will not only prevent her from taking damage, but also give her interruption resistance, which she lacks at C0. The general trade-off for using shielders is the damage potential of Arlecchino or even the teams, so you may see a noticeable difference in damage performance opting for offensive supports instead of shield utility. If you're skilled enough at dodging, then shielders may not be as preferable anymore, but ultimately use a team that provides your preferred level of comfort, and if you do want the security, then having a shielder is a simple solution. Teammates that can also decrease the damage she takes and give interruption resistance buffs are also welcome to make her tankier, like Xingqiu, Beidou, or even Dia, who also redirects most of the damage taken to her instead. Other supports will consist of the usual buffers or debuffers, who will enhance her or the team's damage, such as giving huge attack buffs like Bennett, reducing enemy resistance like Animo Swirlers, providing damage bonuses, a normal attack buffer, and so on. Also, having off-field damage dealers that synergize with her on-field playstyle and elemental applicators to set up pyro-related reactions are instrumental as well for many of her strong teams. Let's go through the standard reaction templates and summarize how they work. First up is Vaporize teams. She needs reliable hydro application so that she can trigger Vaporize reactions, with Xingqiu and Yelan being the primary candidates for strong and consistent off-field applicators and damage dealers. Of course, you can also use both Xingqiu and Yelan together for very fast application and high single target hydro damage. Xingqiu does reduce the damage taken and provides an interruption resistance buff, which helps with Arlecchino's survivability, whereas Yelan applies an increasing damage bonus buff to her for more offense. Other hydro teammates may have less consistent hydro application, which may require them to be comped with another hydro teammate. Farina is a tricky case, as she can amplify survivability issues considering her HP drain plus Arlecchino's healing limitation. Farina's fanfare stacking speed and damage bonus can also get affected when Arlecchino eventually gets stuck at 50% HP until she heals herself. Abyss runs with her can certainly clear, but it felt riskier most of the time, so I generally don't recommend it for those who don't want to deal with such concerns. Other highly recommended supports are Bennett for his buffs, an Animo support for VV shredding, and additional buffs like Kazuha's damage bonus or Sucrus's EM buff, or a defensive support that can give shields or interruption resistance buffs. But in general, as long as it doesn't ruin the Vaporize setup, it can work in the team at varying degrees of synergy. A variation of Vaporize would be Overload Vaporize or Overvape, which includes an Electro unit like Fischl. Using Electro and Hydro application to proc Electro Charge allows both elemental auras to exist at once, so using Pyro on affected enemies will simultaneously proc Overload and Vaporize. Alternatively, comping a Cryo unit in a Vape team can apply the Cryo Aura or freeze an enemy, which introduces melt reactions. However, bosses cannot be frozen, and the Cryo Aura cancels out the Hydro Aura if the enemy cannot be frozen, so this isn't recommended in such cases. Next are Melt teams, which can either work as Arlecchino triggering melts with the help of off-field cryo applicators, or helping set up a Cryo DPS to trigger melt instead. Using Pyro units to trigger melts is more difficult to execute due to how Pyro removes the Cryo Aura instantly. As such, you want multiple sources of cryo application to help maintain a Cryo Aura and let Arlecchino trigger melt as consistently as possible. This also means you want to control her Pyro attacks more deliberately, as attacking too fast would cause Pyro to overtake Cryo, thereby causing Cryo to trigger more melts. The alternative is that you can assign an off-field Cryo DPS to trigger melt instead, particularly Rosaria or Kaya, while Arlecchino deals raw Pyro damage. Using supports supports like Bennett or Animo units can further help buff their damage too. At least if Arlecchino steals some melts, that's still good damage either way. But I would recommend Vaporized teams over melt for Arlecchino, especially for ease of gameplay and team setups. Next, you have the ordinary overload templates, which generally consist of Pyro and Electro units plus an Animo VV Shredder, but there's also the fairly new Chevreuse overload teams that exclusively use Pyro and Electro units. You want off-field Electro DPSs like Fischl, Yae, or Beidou, for example, with Beidou being great for her defensive utilities as well. Having consistent off-field Electro application will also ensure that Chevreuse's resistance shred is easily maintained. Then the last slot can either be an Electro or Pyro support or off-field DPS. Also, remember that overload teams are best played against heavy enemies that won't get thrown around from overload explosions. Then there's the mono Pyro format, which can still be quite strong despite the lack of amplifying reactions, and will be quite straightforward to play as they involve very little to no reaction setups. The classic Pyro teammates here would be Bennett and Xiangling, who will help buff Arlecchino's damage and provide more AoE Pyro damage, plus an Animo support for the VV Shred or a Shielder, ideally Zhongli for the resistance shred. Certain constellations like Bennett C6 and Xiangling C1 and C6 all help boost the team's Pyro damage too, so those are nice to have to make Arlecchino deal more damage as well. Double Geo combos can be attached to some of these templates discussed, such as a double Pyro Geo variant or Vaporized plus double Geo comps. Geo Resonance increases your damage as long as you have a shield active, which can be from a Geo Shielder like Zhongli or crystallized reactions. An off-field Geo DPS like Chiori can contribute more damage, or a Geo support like Yunjin can buff Arlecchino's damage. With a Shielder and or by getting crystallized shields, it provides defensive benefits by default as well for comfort. It's a nice combo, especially if you don't want to bother as much with reactions. As a special mention, if you have Xianyun, you can also try Arlecchino in a plunge playstyle, like in a plunge vaporizer mono Pyro team, for example. Now, if you're considering Arlecchino as a Burgeon trigger, then a big factor to account for is the self-damage of Burgeon, which is worse since Arlecchino can't be healed by teammates. So if ever you'll really want a shielder teammate, which also restricts your possible roster. Her Pyro application can also get relatively fast, which can lead to more burning up time or less Dendro core generation. You'd preferably want Xingqiu as your fast off-field Hydro applicator, and Nahida for the consistent Dendro application and EM buff. Arlecchino's build here will differ, as it involves stacking EM stats and bonuses from her artifacts and weapons. However, it's not one of her playstyles I'd really recommend, and I'd sooner advise you stick to previous templates discussed. Ultimately, these are just some examples of Arlecchino's teams that I've tried out, but there are many other possibilities you should explore for yourself or watch out for in future team discussions, especially since the roster of Genshin is quite large and will continue to expand. So far, I find Father to be an impressive DPS that performs very well in most standard Pyro-focused team formats. Her unique use of the Bond of Life mechanic is quite interesting for me and helps her stand out among the many DPSs we currently have, and the damage payoff is rewarding. Despite that, her core gameplay is easy to pick up and execute. Again, the major aspect that could take some getting used to is her healing limitation, and it's more punishing if she takes too much damage, as that can interrupt your rotation or put you in risky situations. But that has workarounds through shielders and dodging skills. As long as you understand what she entails, then she can be a blast to play, especially with her insanely badass moves. But let me know what you think about Father in the comments and whether or not you're pulling for her. That's going to be all for this Arlecchino guide, so if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!